Hello, and thank you so much for joining our webinar today. I'm Tommy Marzella, a marketing manager for IgnitionOne, and I'll be moderating the discussion. With competition in search constantly increasing and cost per clicks on the rise, a personalized marketing strategy based on refined audiences is fast becoming a marketer's most important tool. In today's webinar, we are first going to be discussing the challenge with search and how it can be addressed, specifically by leveraging data in audience creation, creating targeted messaging strategies, and the role of phone in SEM. As a reminder, this webinar will be recorded and a playback will be shared shortly after. If you have questions or issues during the session, please be sure to get in touch with us using the chat functionality of the platform. We will have time for a Q&A at the end. Also, you can join the conversation on Twitter by using the hashtag #AudiencePower. On that note, I'd like to welcome our three hosts today. Our first host is Dave Ragals, who serves as the Global Managing Director of Search for IgnitionOne, where he runs the company's global search marketing business. Our second host is Rob Blenderman, who is the Chief Operations Officer at Boost Media and co-founder of the company. Rob oversees ongoing business operations within Boost Media. Our final host is Steve Griffiths, who is the SVP of Marketing, Strategy, and Analytics at DialogTech. He is an expert on attribution, automation, and optimization. I'd now like to pass it over to Dave Ragals to introduce I1 and kick off the presentation. Dave?
Thanks, Tommy. And for those of you who are not familiar with IgnitionOne, our digital marketing suite is what you might call the world's first marketing cloud. We simplify life for marketers by providing an integrated suite of solutions, including customer data management, to really help improve digital marketing performance across all devices. So as Tommy mentioned, the challenge here is within search, it remains a steady performer in all verticals, as it has been for years. But as we've all seen, inventory is finite and cost per clicks are going up. In fact, year-over-year growth of CPCs in Q2 of this year amongst our client set was 13.3% on average. And in Q3, it continued to climb, up another 10.2%. So as marketers, we have a challenge, and we have to shift our focus a bit. And one area where we can really shift our focus is to the audience. Who's searching for our products and offerings to really help maximize the marketing impact? Now, remarketing lists for search ads, or RLSA, has been gaining momentum over the past couple of years, and we're seeing similar offerings from Bing now as well. Simply put, they let you customize your search campaigns for people who have previously visited your site and tailor your bids and ads to these visitors when they're searching. And it's been effective. Advertisers are seeing noticeable improvements in click-through rate, seeing lower CPCs and higher conversion rates, all of which is great, but as many marketers have experienced, definitely somewhat limited in terms of what you can do. So how can you overcome these shortcomings? Using smarter data to provide an even more customized experience throughout the conversion process. RLSA is a powerful tool, but without the proper data about your audiences, much of its potential really remains untapped. So we find it's crucial to take a holistic approach in your marketing. When all of your audience data is gathered in one place, you can use that to create a seamless experience for your user without a single point of disconnect. And then when combined with strategic ad testing and personalized calls to action, you can really maximize the effectiveness of every piece of creative you push out into the world. Historically, it's been really difficult to know your search audience until the point in which they convert. You're often in the dark about any potential customer up until then. You can make assumptions about them based on the keywords they query and the ads they click on, but that's not really the same thing as having powerful first and third party data when they enter a query. Now, with the power of audience analytics, it's possible to know your customer before they even become your customer through that combined use of first and third party data. First party data regarding things like their user engagement score, their propensity to convert. It's a really strong way to get to know the behavior of a current user on your website. And the third-party data can really help you understand who your audience is by pulling together multiple pieces of data, often from various sources, to form a more complete picture, and thus better help you market to your potential audience. So if you know that your product is of more value to people who fit a specific demographic profile, say a specific age group or education level or a combination of those plus their physical location, plus they've shown an affinity for certain products or offerings on your site and perhaps are not prior customers, you can reach them with highly targeted creative and bid higher on that very specific group. And then you can build these out tenfold for a variety of profiles or personas, all of which have different values to your business. It's essentially taking the concept of RLSA, removing the black box that surrounds it, and then amplifying it with unlimited input. Now, understanding your audience is only one step towards making the strongest impact. Once you've found them, understanding how to message to them with the right creative and calls to action is equally important. So now I'd like to turn it over to Rob at Boost Media to talk more about this aspect.
Hey, thanks, Dave. So Boost Media is a company that's dedicated to helping people with their creative, both text and image-based, across all different platforms. And one of the things that we do is look at audience data from people like IgnitionOne and help to understand what the messaging should be. So as we look at the benefits of these audience-powered insights, Dave mentioned that you have to obviously define the audiences, segment them, understand what they're about. You also have to get the ability to bid, placement, all sorts of things that are going on. And then you have to have the creative. And creative, as you get into audience-based targeting, is very important because it's not big brand-based type messaging. It's very specific many times to products or to experiences and things like that. And so we're going to go through a couple examples. And we're also going to look at how to break things down and the process of creating creative for audiences. So as we look at this target messaging funnel, it's really, really important. We start out with broad-based audiences. So those are people that have done things like visit your website. They've come to your home page and maybe browsed around a couple of different things, left, came back again, all sorts of very broad behavior that you can't necessarily gauge what they're looking at, but you can tell that they're interested in your company. You then get into more specific audiences. So specific audiences are they look at particular categories of things. They look at, even more specific, particular products. Even more specific, they put a particular product in a shopping cart. All sorts of things that get you higher in the funnel from a specific nature, but also lower volume. Typically what you find is that broad is a lot of people. And then as you go up the funnel or up the pyramid, you find that there are fewer and fewer people in each audience segment. So how many people look for an iPhone? Pretty big. How many people look for a particular model of an iPhone? It's smaller than the generics and smaller than the broad. So you want to think about segmenting things based on volume. So it's important to not over-segment and to go to a point where you're segmenting down to one person. And we'll talk a little bit about why that's important in a moment. But essentially, once you've decided what your segments are, you start to then align the message to those segments. So in my example, you're looking at cell phones, types, specific models. The messaging needs to align with that such that you are talking specifically about what the person was looking at in the audience that you put them in. And then that comes back to the ROI. You can spend a lot of time creating messages and creating segments and all sorts of things, but if the ROI isn't there because the effort is too high compared to, say, the audience size, you've gone a little too far. So you have to learn to draw the line in terms of alignment of messages and how much segmentation you do. So let's get into a specific example. So we start broad, right? We have a Verizon smartphone, very broad. It's mostly around their brand. It's about sort of generic, shopping the latest phones, discovering more variety, It's someone that's come to your website before, they've looked around, nothing in particular that they looked at. Maybe they looked at some of your pricing plans, no phones in particular, but they're sort of broad. So then we take it to a more specific audience. And the more specific audience is they came in, they browsed around, but they were interested in Samsung in particular. Now Samsung has a lot of different phones. They don't just have one phone. They have different phones for different likes and different types of people, big phones, small phones, long battery life, all sorts of things. So as you move down or move up that pyramid, you get a little more specific with Samsung. So it starts talking about Samsung in particular. They have them at Verizon, get yours today. So then let's go a little more specific. So someone comes in, visits your website, visits Samsung, and then visits a particular model number, a particular type of phone, the S6. In fact, it's the S6 Edge Plus. So it's even more specific than S6. And then you'll notice here that the messaging went from being a little more generic to a little more specific. So for instance, this particular phone dealing with built-in wireless charging. So that's a very specific feature of this phone. And as you're talking to this audience that's looking at this phone, you want to start bringing out these more specific things. And we're going to talk in a moment about how to do that and the process for doing that. So let's look at another example, which is an image ad on display network. So you'll see here in the broad category, we've got the free phones, it's Verizon, it's different types of phones. It's unclear which phones you're looking at. But it's sort of talking about the messaging of why you want to go to Verizon to get a phone because it's free. That's speaking to this broad audience where you don't necessarily know what feature they're looking for, but you're talking about a benefit of free to a broader audience where it's probably applicable at this level. Then we get into the more specific. And the more specific is someone that has come in, they looked for this Galaxy Note 2, they're in that audience, and the advertising here is very specific. It's one, talking about the phone in particular, two, giving you a price, three, it's talking about their network, it's showing a stylus, it's showing you things and talking about things that are very particular to this phone, which won't apply to other phones. But as someone who's browsing around the web and sees this advertising somewhere, and by the way, they've looked at this phone before on your website, they are now keyed in on what it is that they're interested in. So bigger screens, stylus, all this sort of stuff. So it's important to bring this messaging down to be the specific way of looking at it. So let's look at understanding the why. So it's important to bring the messaging down to the individual product level or the individual audience level and have the messaging be very specific to that. But the question is, like, how do you do that? It's easy to say, it's a little harder to do. So the first is you can't just define the audience. If all you do is define the audience and stop there, there's two steps that you're sort of missing. The major step is understanding what's going to go into that creative. What is it going to say? It's easy to choose very generic stuff. It's easy to say, well, we'll just swap out the picture of the phone. But that's really not getting to why people care about that phone. So what you want to do is you want to go deeper. You want to understand the customer's motivation for purchasing. So for instance, on particular phones, you may want to emphasize that it's a very large screen, or it's a very long battery life, or it has a stylus, or it's very small, or whatever it might be that separates that phone from other phones. So in your creative, you actually want to emphasize that, whether it's through words, as we saw earlier, we talked about built-in wireless, or it's through pictures where we show things like a stylus. It's important to get those features across and those benefits across to people in the advertising because you are doing audience-based marketing. You want to get across what they've been looking at. The other is you want to sort of reinforce these motivations to make sure that they are coming across because every different audience that you create, for the most part, depending on how specific or broad you're going, will have a different level of motivation. So let's look at how we actually do this. So how do we actually optimize our account? We start at step one right at the top, and we look at understanding those motivators. So we just talked about why they're important It's a kind of thing where you have to actually ask people a lot of times. You won't necessarily understand the motivation for one phone over another. I have a motivation, for instance, for picking a particular type of phone because I have things that I want out of it, like long battery life. And then others won't necessarily want those kinds of things. They want maybe a bigger screen, which doesn't necessarily come along with long battery life. So you have to understand those motivations. One of the ways that we see this work really well is asking people. So you can ask your customers, you can ask people in your family, you can ask the guy that sits next to you, you can ask all sorts of people for their opinion about why they think someone would want to buy something. The next is you want to communicate this with the creative. So this is a very important step. It's a subtle step, but it's very, very important. It's important to understand that once you understand these motivations, you have to get this information to the person or the team that is going to be creating your creative. So if you're writing it or you're giving it to a writer, make sure they understand these motivations. If you're giving it to a Photoshop designer, make sure they understand these motivations, they understand what to highlight. Without that information, you will get back very, very bland or off-target type of creative because it's only one person's opinion. And you need to take a multitude of opinions and give it to the person doing the creative. You then obviously have them produce the creative. And when they do this, what you really want is to have them produce a couple of different variations of things, whether it be colors, things like that, but also, is it the long battery life or the big screen or the stylus or whatever it might be, or wireless charging. Produce a couple of different options so that you can see what resonates and find the path to go in subsequent rounds. We then test and measure. It doesn't do much good for you to take a shot at this and hope for the best. You actually have to test these things, put a little bit of your spend behind trying something that may be underperforming, but give it a chance, measure it, understand what's going on. The reason we test and measure is because we actually want to learn something. The testing and measuring in and of itself is not all that useful. It's just that we learn something that then allows us to go on to the next stage. And the next stage is to take those learnings and create more messages to test the next time. So for instance, on that Samsung Galaxy Note 2, it's the stylus that we think was working. When we tested it without the stylus, it didn't work well. And so we understand some of the motivations is people actually want to treat it more like a notebook and things like that, hence the name, than they do a regular phone. So they then move on to doing this again. Once we've collected some data, it helps us to refine those motivators and understanding them, and we then continue on the process of continuing to optimize. So in summary, let's look at what we've learned so far. So Dave mentioned about audiences and creating the audiences, very important. We start broad, we go specific, we understand the audience by thinking about what message we need to serve them. We then take it a level lower and we really think through the motivation. And this is actually not a 30-second exercise. It spends some minutes thinking about why someone really wants a particular product and understanding that, and communicate that to your creative team as the final step. When you communicate that to your creative team, you will find that they will come back with stuff the first time that will work better than the generic stuff that you're sort of used to. And it's a very, very important step. Otherwise, you can spin your wheels a little too much on this. So I'm going to turn it over to Steve, and he's going to talk a little bit about calls and tracking offline.
Great, thanks, Rob. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I'm Steve Griffiths, and DialogTech is the leader in call attribution and conversion for data-driven marketers. And what our software platform does is we help marketers understand the role that phone calls play in marketing and in the path to purchase. And what we'd like to talk about a little bit today is how you can leverage some of the data and the dynamics around the call conversion path as far as targeting audiences and developing personalized experiences for those audiences that elect to convert over the phone. So we all know that mobile is critical to paid search, but let's take a quick look at a few statistics just to lay the groundwork. So smartphone ownership in the U.S. today is skyrocketing. Over 80% of adults between the ages of 18 and 49 have a smartphone. So nearly everyone. And Google reported earlier this year that over half of searches are now on mobile devices. So continuing to increase, and what we're seeing is projections by firms such as eMarketer that by 2017, over 70% of paid search dollars will be targeting mobile. This phenomenon exists everywhere. It exists on, in particular, at the local level. We've seen an explosion in the number of search queries for local mobile, so much that more than double the mobile local searches are expected in 29 from last year. So mobile and search are quickly becoming synonymous. And what we're seeing is potentially an unlikely impact of that, which is more and more phone calls into businesses. And if you think about it, it makes sense. The most natural conversion path for many scenarios on a mobile device is a click-to-call. It's simply pressing a button to engage with a business over the phone versus filling out a lead gen form or working through an e-commerce checkout process or some other desktop paradigm that doesn't necessarily translate as well to a mobile environment. And so what we see is an explosion in the number of phone calls being driven into businesses as a result of paid search. So you can see the chart here on the left. This is from an industry research firm, BIA Kelsey, who spends a lot of time looking at this space, and they project that there will be 73 billion phone calls driven into U.S. businesses from mobile search in 2018. That number is nearly double what it was just last year at 38 billion. So pretty rapid growth, and this is good news for marketers. In a survey of businesses, most people say, what's the most valuable conversion path? It's a phone call. And the reason is, if you think about what you can do when you've actually got a potential customer on the phone, you can explain your value proposition. You can answer questions. You can capture some of those dynamics in a human conversation that don't always are not always available in other modalities like online conversions or emails, sometimes even in-person visits. So this is overall good news for marketers. So as we think about how this impacts audiences and personalizing messages for audiences, the first step in doing so is making sure we've got a full attribution picture. So digital marketers have really benefited from the immense data that has been provided to them by the web. We now can understand where people click, where they convert, what happens to these digital interactions so that we can demonstrate the impact of marketing programs on leads, on revenue, on the bottom line, etc. One of the challenges that this dynamic of calls presents is a lot of the data that is associated with those conversions gets sort of sucked into a black hole, if you will, when someone elects to pick up the phone and call your business. What keywords did they search? What campaign was it associated with? When did that conversion happen? What time of day did that conversion happen? What day of the week, etc. All this information is no longer available. And that's a real challenge for many marketers. There are solutions that can help address that. Specifically, trackable phone numbers that you can integrate into your paid search strategy, or really any channel, to track calls both from ads, paid search ads, as well as from your landing pages should one of those visitors elect to click through your ad and go to your website. And with that, you can then assemble all of this information about the caller and integrate that data into your processes and get the attribution that you need to understand what actually is driving conversions. So one way that you can use this call data, Dave spoke about remarketing audiences early on. You could use call data in your remarketing programs to do a few different things. One could be you could simply strip out people that have called your business already and not show them a remarketing ad. The idea being they've already converted, so don't invest additional marketing dollars serving them ads. That might be one approach. Another approach might be, since they've already called your business and they're familiar with what you do and what you offer them, you could tailor the ad that they see, potentially by a product. Or if they're an existing customer, upsell, cross-sell kinds of ads. So tailoring that creative to that audience based on the fact that they have or have not called your business in the past. And when we think about this data, a key part of it is getting it into the other solutions that you're already using, like a bid management solution, like a web analytics tool, IgnitionOne for example, so that you can see and use your call data alongside of your web data to really close the loop and get a full picture of attribution. Okay, so now we're working with a full set of data. We understand the online conversion path. We understand conversion through the call channel. How do we then personalize the experience for these specific audiences that we're going after when they convert through the call channel? So it really goes back to a lot of the same data that we already touched on. There is so much information that you have about a caller, or can have about a caller, before they pick up the phone. Their query, where physically in the world they happen to be calling from. What ad or campaign was it that drove them to pick up the phone and call? What pages on your site did they look at before they called and after they called? There's really, really rich profiles that you can essentially build about a caller, and you can use that information to figure out who in my organization is the best person to get this call. And then you route that phone call to that person, whether it's in a contact center environment and you've got people with specific domain expertise or industry knowledge. If you're operating in a franchise arrangement and you need to route those calls to different local franchises or different franchises with expertise, dealerships, retail stores, whatever the case may be, you can use this information to sort of play matchmaker, so that you've got two people engaged in conversation that makes sense to talk to one another. So from the marketer's point of view, you're improving your conversion because you're getting those calls to the right people that are best equipped to convert them. And from the customer perspective, they're just going to have a better experience. They're going to talk to someone that's better suited to meet their needs because you got them to the right place in your company. Now, not all calls are created equally. We've seen this increase in calls, but not all of them are actually qualified sales leads. Some could be people simply looking for hours and direction. Some could be pocket dials, et cetera. So one way to do that is to qualify those callers before you pass them along into your organization to make sure you're really separating the wheat from the chaff. One way to do that is through IVR, interactive voice response. This is putting one or two qualifying questions in the call experience before you send them to a person. Now, we've all called the banks. We've all called the airlines. We've all called the cable companies and had those terrible experiences fighting through phone trees. That absolutely is not the best practice. However, one question, maybe two, can go a long way to actually getting the person to the right place and providing a better experience for them in the end. Okay, so now you've figured out how to get calls to the right person in the organization, you've filtered out the good from the bad. Then the next piece is to arm the recipient of that call with all the relevant information on that person, on that audience, if you will, and personalize the caller experience. So those same parameters that we talked about, the campaign information, the location information, the marketing source information, pulling in data from first and third party sources to build a profile of that caller and then delivering that with the call. So whoever it is that says hello now is armed with this data and can begin immediately serving that customer's needs. So you fast forward, and you've been doing this for a while. The next thing that you can leverage is the ability to analyze what happened on that call. So understanding that the phone rang is important, but wouldn't it be better to say, well, did a sale happen? Was an appointment set? Did nothing happen? All of those are relevant. So there are solutions that you can use to essentially transcribe your calls, turn them into data, and make that data searchable and indexable. And what you can do is a few things. First is really understand not only call attribution, but sale attribution. Was this really an outcome that led to revenue for my business? You can also dig in and understand what happened on the call. For example, you can look for keywords and phrases that were spoken by the caller, and it turns out that a lot of times the things that people search for and the things that people say on the phone are the same or similar. So by looking at what actually was said on the call, you can use that information to inform your keyword strategy, your bid strategy, etc., and plow all of that back into the top of the process to continue to optimize your programs. So in short, calls are an important dynamic in paid search today, and as you look to customize your programs to reach specific audiences, there are some tools that you can take advantage to help you do that. So that concludes our prepared remarks for today. With that, we would like to open it up for Q&A.
Thank you, guys. And this is Tommy again. As a reminder, you guys can send your questions in the bottom left. We currently have one coming in from Chad right now that says, how do I create images that are segmented by audience? And I think that this would be a good question for Boost to answer.
Yeah, so that's sort of what we were getting at in terms of you start with the audience. So you define, say, a handful of audiences. You really have to get that motivation. If you don't understand the motivation of that audience, you're not going to know what to build. It's like a white blank canvas that you're just going to stare at. And so you really first have to start with saying, okay, I've created an audience. What is it that they were looking for? What is the definition of this audience? What motivates them as human beings? Remember, we're always marketing to humans, not computers, and audiences are just a way to bucket people. So think about the human being and think about what they care about and what motivates them, and that will actually help drive the actual creative that you come up with. Remember, if you're going to use a creative group, hand off that information so they understand what they're going after, and then test.
Thank you. We have another one that just came in from Chad that said, how do you tie together call data and audience messaging?
Sure. This is Steve from DialogTech. So you can essentially, you're essentially going to pool your messaging, and if you think about pooling or tagging that messaging, and then based on that campaign or those set of ads, you can design routing determinations that dictate where those phone calls go. And then you can get reporting and analytics that show information about those campaigns. How many calls, what was the duration of those calls, what happened on those calls, things of that nature. So you'll be able to understand for a specific set of messaging, for a specific set of audiences, how that performed, and then compare them to others.
Thank you. We have another question coming in from Anthony. So Dave, I think this might be a good one for you, but it was asking if you can just provide an example of how RLSA might be used with a DMP. I know that there had been some recent changes, so if you could just talk a little bit more about that.
Sure. That's a great question. I mean, essentially, the DMP, depending on what you're using and what data you have available to it, can should absolutely allow you to create some of those much more refined and targeted audiences that I was talking about before. With IgnitionOne, that data management is part of our hub, and so that's native within the platform. So you're doing it within there without tying systems together. But if you have a DMP that in which you're creating audiences, let's say for Facebook or for prospecting or anything else, you can use that first and third party data to create those finer audiences. The key though, and this is something that that we do with our platform, the key is being able to refine when that remarketing pixel essentially gets fired based on that first and third party data. So the other component of it is having a system that will essentially conditionally fire that pixel to opt somebody in only when they meet the criteria, because you have to use, in the case of RLSA, you have to use Google's remarketing pixel. And they're going to fire it based on a very limited set of rules. Persons visit this page or that page, etc. So you need another system, whether it's ours or another system, that will conditionally fire it based on the combination of those Google rules as well as the DMP conditions that you set up.
Great. Thank you, Dave. This is another one for Steve. So it says you talk about IVR to better qualify callers. What about additional safe blocks to eliminate or reduce robot calls that leave hour-plus long messages that fill up voicemail after hours?
Sure, that's a great question. So there are technologies out there to filter and prevent robocalls, spam calls, whatever you want to call them. At DialogTech, we have a number of solutions to do that. Spammers are crafty. They figure out different ways to generate robocalls, and there are a few ways that you can detect whether or not it's a human being on the other end of the line, and IVR is one of them. But there are other algorithmic technologies that you can use to just stop it at the source. And so, if you're looking at call attribution and conversion, that's definitely something you'll want to ask who you're talking to about.
Great. And then this one, I know this is for Boost. So how do I understand what motivates a customer, and what is the process for doing that? I know you touched on that a little bit more, or a little bit in your presentation, but if you could just go into a little bit more detail for Carla.
Yeah, so the way to think about that is, as I was saying, it's sometimes difficult if you're trying to do it alone. So there's a couple of different ways to do it. If you're a smaller, mid-sized business and you don't necessarily have a lot of research around customers or user testing or all sorts of things, one of the things you can do is ask old customers, talk to new customers through surveying them as well after the purchase. The other is talk to other people in your organization. Why do you think people buy this? What do you think is a motivator for someone that's using this product? Talking to people that are normal users. So for instance, talking to someone about a laptop, if all they like is desktops, isn't that useful? So you want to try to find a subset of people that you can use as a sounding board on the low end to try to get this information and come up with some ideas. And that's where the testing comes in. You're not trying to be perfect. What you're trying to do is generate ideas. The testing will prove out what works. So don't focus on whether it's right or wrong. The testing proves that. And then as you get bigger in a larger organization, you'll have a lot of information around studies and surveys that you've done typically that will be very useful. One of the things that I actually find is a great way, especially if you have a smaller set of products, not 1,000 different things, is I actually like to ask new employees. Because they come to the table with a fresh perspective and they don't really know what the product is about at the detailed level, and they haven't focused in on the things as a company you're thinking about. And so they're a great resource for that kind of stuff.
Thanks so much. And it looks like we just have a couple more questions. So we have one. What happens if a lead visits my paid search landing page but then browses to my main site before calling me from a different web page? They wanted to know if they could still track that back to the right keyword search and ad.
If someone starts on a landing page but then browses throughout the website, is that the question?
Yes, correct. Throughout the main site before calling from a different web page.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. That can be tracked, and that's part of the power in understanding what those leads are doing is understanding where they come in, what they do after they come in, and then where in that click stream they pick up the phone and call. So depending on your business, those could lead you in different directions. It could be an interesting, funnel through which you try to drive more traffic, or it could be that they're hitting a roadblock. They're not getting the information that they want, which is why they're calling at some point. So, but the answer is yes, you absolutely can track even if somebody leaves the landing page.
And on that note, actually, this might be like a best practice, but Colleen was curious if local numbers are more likely to generate calls for local campaigns versus toll-free.
Yes, absolutely. We've seen that in our customer data, sort of using local numbers, and depending on where you are, not only local area codes, but even local exchanges, which are the second set of 3 digits in a phone number, can be a great way to project a local image, whether you're a local business or a national business trying to generate local conversions.
Great. And then I think a nice way to wrap up might be just to ask each company, what trends do you see that we can prepare for in 2016 based on, your respective product offerings and your areas of specialty? So, for example,
sure,
sorry.
Yeah, this is Steve from DialogTech. I'll go first. It sounds like old soup reheated, but mobile is literally taken over the world, and understanding the ripple effects of mobile as it manifests across all digital marketing channels is something that's going to continue to happen in 2016. We of course spent a lot of time thinking about phone calls as a result of that, and giving our customers the ability to track and analyze and manage those conversions with the same level of sophistication that they're accustomed to on the web.
Yeah, this is Rob. I'll give you my answer. So I'd echo that as well. We're seeing a lot more interest in mobile. From a messaging standpoint, it's important because if you think about, again, the motivation and the experience of the human, many times traditionally you're used to a desktop at home, and now it's a guy standing on the street outside your store. So there's the experience is different, and because the experience is different and their motivations are different, the messaging changes. Along with that, we're seeing a lot of interest in images as Gemini ramps up. And a number of other things are ramping up. You're seeing more interest in image and text coming into play as opposed to just traditional text that people are used to in AdWords.
And this is Dave, and certainly hard to argue with what those two both have talked about. Certainly from a mobile perspective, I would wrap that into a broader category of the audience. And trying to tie it to what we've just been talking about. I think last year there was a lot of talk about the death of the keyword, between feed-based and DSA and other things like that. I think this year's real topic is around the audience, and that's the big trend, is really being able to understand the search audience and being able to target your messaging. And I think we're going to see a lot more growth in that area, whether it's through new offerings from the search engines or other data providers or system providers, or whether it's kind of opening the floodgates a bit more on programs like RLSA and allowing to hit a larger part of the audience. I think it's sort of in some ways, while search has been the slow and steady performer, over the years, I think this is really the place where it can be dynamic, and by leveraging a lot of the things that we can do elsewhere in display and Facebook, et cetera, and then being able to manage those consistently across those programs, I think that's really going to be that's the big trend we're hearing from our clients, and I think where the big growth is going to come from.
Okay. Well, I wanted to take the time to thank all of our speakers for taking time out of their schedule to meet with us today. As a reminder, a recorded playback will be available and sent out shortly after the final conclusion of this webinar. And so on that note, thank you all for joining us today, and please join us for future webinars. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.